The desert air at Fire Ridge Base never moved gently. By 6:30 a.m., Rebecca "Becca" Martinez was already walking the flight line, her worn flight gloves looped through her belt, the morning sun casting harsh shadows across rows of gleaming aircraft. The newer F-16 Vipers and visiting Rafale jets sparkled under the Nevada sun, their surfaces polished to mirror perfection, unit patches bright and fresh. Squadron logos caught the light like jewelry. Then there was her jet. Parked at the far end of the strip, away from the show planes, sat an F-16C that looked like it belonged to a different era. The matte gray paint was sun-faded, engine intake. Worn to primer, scuff marks around the ladder mounts that hadn't been cleaned in months. Someone had scraped away the squadron patch entirely. The tail markings were regulation, but plain as cardboard. Becca approached without fanfare. She'd learned to move like a shadow here at Fire Ridge, invisible among the golden boys of the 64th Aggressor Squadron. The other pilots, mostly flying the newer Rafale jets on loan from the French Air Force, clustered near the briefing tents. Their laughter carried across the tarmac, the easy confidence of men who'd never been told they didn't belong. She'd arrived at Fire Ridge 3 months ago, fresh from completing her F-16 qualification. What should have been a career milestone felt more like exile. While her flight school classmates got assigned to active combat squadrons, Becca found herself here, supposedly gaining valuable experience with the Aggressor program. The reality was different. A pale rectangle of paper fluttered on her aircraft's fuselage, taped near the cockpit. Someone had scribbled on it in black pen. Not. For tactical use. Observer flight only. She didn't touch it. She never did. Opening her kneeboard, Becca flipped through pages of hand-drawn thermal decay curves, pencil notations covering every margin. While the other pilots relied on digital readouts and computer analysis, she'd been studying flare dispersion patterns. In relation to engine load cycles, no one had asked her to. But if she was going to sit in the air doing nothing, she was going to do it right. From the radio tent, a voice boomed across the morning air. "Roll order for today's exercise!" Teams were listed by aircraft type, starting with the Rafale pilots, then the F-22 Raptors and Super Hornets. There was no mention of her jet, no mention of her name. Someone behind the tent muttered about heat babysitters logging shadow data. A few heads turned and grinned, but not at her. Becca climbed her ladder slowly, not from lack of confidence, but from respect for the machine. Inside the cockpit, she settled into the familiar routine. Battery switch, manual flare deploy, systems check. On the right side of her panel, a piece of green tape covered where a call sign used to be. The name beneath had long since rubbed off. She hadn't asked to replace it. Through her canopy, she watched the Rafale pilots taxi past. One gave a sharp salute to his crew chief, then glanced toward her aircraft. He said something to the man beside him, something too quiet to hear. But they both laughed. Not cruel, just certain she didn't matter. Major David Hawkins ran the morning briefing from the portable command trailer. Inside, the air was too cold, the generator's hum underlining every word that carried weight. Folding chairs faced wall-mounted. Screens where flight paths rotated in color-coded precision. Becca stood against the back wall, clipboard flat against her thigh, waiting for assignments that never included her name. "Quartz leads," Hawkins called out without looking up. "2 Rafales up front, Belgian pair in trail, Falcon side, Raptors." In wedge formation, Navy Hornets following. Altitude ceiling 47,000 feet. A pause. Pilots exchanged nods. Someone cracked knuckles. "Thermal observer," Hawkins added offhandedly. 15-minute stagger delay. Clean corridor sweep. Watch your margins. Do not engage. No one turned around. Captain James Wright, leaning against a file cabinet, tilted his chin toward his wingman and whispered something. The other pilot's shoulders shook with silent laughter. Becca stepped toward the mission map on the back table. Wright slid it aside. Before she could reach it. Not sharply, not with hostility, just as if she didn't need it. "Just track the heat data," someone said. "Don't mix with the main group." As she moved toward the exit, she caught the sound of someone behind her making clicking noises, imitating a handheld recorder. Another voice responded, "Make sure you get her good side. Data sheet in focus." Outside, the sun had burned away. The early haze. The Rafales lined the main taxiway, canopies already closed, pilots focused and ready. 2 crew members leaned against a fuel cart, their conversation floating clearly across the concrete. "Did you see Observer Girl in the briefing? Still logging imaginary numbers?" "She's probably got spreadsheets for our afterburner timing. Bet she graphs us like fireworks." "Please, she's here for paperwork, not the playbook." Their laughter was soft, confident, like nothing they said could echo beyond the moment. Becca passed them on the outer edge of the ramp, her pace steady. She didn't correct them, didn't flinch. Her gloves hung from her belt in their usual place, fingertips worn soft from countless flights. The clipboard in her hand held more than forms, 12 pages of hand-drawn equations, notations, and timestamp corrections from yesterday's exercise. She found a quiet spot beside a storage crate and sat down, back straight, clipboard on her knee. From her pocket she pulled a small pencil with a broken eraser and began marking a faded template she'd drawn the night before. Each axis represented thermal signature decay after flare deployment. Each curve was a Rafale burn pattern recorded from memory and confirmed through passive visual observation. The data was hers alone. No telemetry pull, no screen capture, just one pilot watching. Others learning what no one bothered to teach her. After 15 minutes, her clipboard held 3 new curves, carefully labeled and shaded. A light wind kicked dust against her boots. She wiped the grid clean and kept writing. Behind her, the flight line buzzed with activity, tool carts clanging, radios crackling, the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid thick in the desert air. The visiting French pilots were already strapping in, their movements efficient and practiced. She could hear fragments of conversation, jokes about American coffee and Nevada heat. None of it included her. She was the observer, the outsider, the pilot who flew but didn't fight. At least, that's what they all believed. Becca closed her notebook and stood up, brushing dust from her flight suit. In 2 hours, she'd be airborne, relegated to a safe corridor while the real pilots played their war games above. She'd collect her data, file her reports, and land to the sound of silence. But today felt different. Today she had something one expected. She had a plan. The morning briefing should have been routine, but tension crackled beneath the surface like static electricity before a thunderstorm. Becca sat in her usual spot, back row, corner seat, close enough to hear, but far enough to be forgotten. The other pilots filled the front rows, their flight suits crisp, patches gleaming, voices carrying the easy confidence of those who'd never been questioned. Major Hawkins clicked through the tactical display, his pointer tracking flight paths across the Nevada desert. Today's exercise simulates a contested airspace scenario. Quartz Squadron, he nodded toward the 4 Rafale pilots, will play aggressor. Your job is to penetrate Falcon Squadron's defensive perimeter and achieve simulated kills. Captain Wright raised his hand. Sir, what about the observer? Should we account for her position in our planning? A few pilots chuckled. Hawkins barely glanced at Becca. Negative. Observer aircraft will maintain safe separation in Corridor 2. She's collecting thermal data only, not a factor in your mission. Lieutenant Amy Foster, one of the few female pilots in the room, caught Becca's eye for a split second. There was something in her expression, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Foster was flying Falcon 3, one of the newer F-16 Vipers. She'd been at Fire Ridge for 8 months and had somehow earned the respect Becca was still fighting for. Thermal observer parameters, Hawkins continued. Altitude ceiling 35,000 feet, 5 nautical mile corridor width. You'll monitor engine. Heat signatures during flare deployment exercises. Keep your radio chatter to minimum. Becca made notes, her handwriting steady despite the familiar sting of dismissal. Around her, pilots were already discussing tactics, forming the kind of casual partnerships that happen naturally when you were included in the real mission. The Rafales have a distinct advantage in close-quarters maneuvering, Hawkins said. Their thrust vectoring and fly-by-wire systems are more advanced than our F-16s. This exercise will test your ability to counter superior technology with superior tactics. Captain Wright leaned back in his chair. Sir, shouldn't be too difficult. The Rafale pilots have been here, 2 weeks? They're still learning our airspace. Don't underestimate them, Hawkins warned. Colonel Dubois and his team didn't come here to lose. They're here to prove their aircraft's superiority in American skies. Becca had been watching the French pilots for weeks, studying their patterns from the ground and during her limited observation flights. Right was wrong. They weren't still learning. They were adapting, evolving, finding weaknesses in American tactics that no one wanted to acknowledge. She documented it all in her private notes. Engine management techniques that extended their combat range, flare deployment patterns that confused American targeting systems, subtle formations that maximized their aircraft's strengths while exploiting F-16 limitations, but no one asked for her input. No one ever did. After the briefing, Foster approached as Becca gathered her materials. "Walk with me," she said quietly. They stepped outside into the desert heat. Foster glanced around, making sure they were alone. "I've been watching the thermal data you collect," she said. "Those hand-drawn charts, they're good, really good." Becca was surprised. She hadn't realized anyone paid attention to her work. "Thank you. I just try to understand the patterns." "The patterns matter," Foster said. "More than these guys want to admit. I've been flying against the Rafales for 3 weeks now, and there's something they're not telling us in the debriefs." "What do you mean?" Foster hesitated, then pulled out her phone, showing Becca a photo of a tactical display. "This is from Tuesday's exercise. Look at the lock-on timings." She pointed to a series of numbers. "The Rafales are achieving target acquisition 30% faster than the intelligence briefings predicted. Either our data is wrong, or they're using techniques we don't understand." Becca studied the image, her mind racing. She'd noticed the same discrepancy in her observations, but hadn't connected the dots. "They're pre-positioning their sensors," she said. "Watch their formation flying. They're sharing targeting data before the engagement even begins." "Exactly. But when I brought this up to Major Hawkins, he said the intelligence was classified above my clearance level." Foster's voice carried frustration. "They're treating this like a public relations exercise instead of real training. What do you want me to do about it?" "Keep collecting your data, keep watching, and if you see something that could help—" "Us level the playing field." Foster paused. "Find a way to let me know." As Foster walked away, Becca felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since arriving at Fire Ridge, someone had acknowledged that her work mattered. More than that, someone needed her expertise. She spent the next hour in the hangar, reviewing her thermal data with new eyes. What she'd thought were random patterns began to reveal themselves as tactical techniques. The Rafales weren't just flying better than expected, they were flying smarter, and in 2 hours, she'd be in the air with them, invisible in her observer role, perfectly positioned to study their methods up close. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flight line as Becca completed her pre-flight inspection. Her F-16 might look shabby compared to the polished fighters around it, but every system was solid. She'd maintained it herself, learning to troubleshoot problems that the crew chiefs were too busy to address. As she climbed into the cockpit, she noticed Colonel Dubois watching her from beside his Rafale. He was older than the other French pilots, his uniform bearing the subtle marks of long experience. When their eyes met, he gave her a slight nod. Professional, nothing more. But it was acknowledgement, and that meant something. Becca strapped in and began her checklist, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar routine. Around her, the other pilots were preparing for combat, their radios crackling with tactical communications. She switched to the observer frequency and heard only silence. In 30 minutes, they'd be airborne. The Rafales would hunt, the F-16s would defend, and she would watch from the sidelines, collecting data that no one wanted to hear. Except today, she wasn't planning to stay on the sidelines. Today, she had questions that needed answers. The Nevada sky stretched endlessly blue as Becca climbed to her assigned altitude, her F-16 settling into the observer corridor like a ghost. At the edge of a party, below, the desert floor spread out in geometric patterns, roads, runways, and restricted zones marked in precise lines that made sense only from the air. "Falcon Flight, check in!" came the voice of Major Reynolds, leading the defensive formation. "Falcon 2, ready!" "Falcon 3, ready!" That was Foster's voice, steady and professional. "Falcon 4, ready!" Becca switched to the observer frequency. Only static answered her. As usual, she was flying alone. From her position at 31,000 feet, she could see the main formation spreading out below, 4 F-16s in a defensive pattern, waiting for the Rafales to make their approach. The French jets were somewhere out there, beyond visual range, preparing their attack. Her thermal sensors were already active, passive collection mode, gathering data on engine signatures and heat patterns. This was her official mission, to observe and record, nothing more. She wasn't even supposed to use her radio except for emergencies. "Quartz flight is airborne and proceeding to Area Delta," announced Colonel Dubois, his accent barely detectable over the radio. Professional. Calm, giving away nothing about his intentions. Becca checked her watch. The exercise would begin in 12 minutes. She pulled out her kneeboard and reviewed the thermal data she'd collected over the past weeks. The patterns were there, subtle but consistent. The Rafales used their superior agility to create false thermal signatures, making it harder for American pilots to distinguish between real threats and decoys. The problem was nobody wanted to hear about it. 3 weeks ago, she'd submitted a detailed report about Rafale thermal management techniques. Major Hawkins had glanced at it for 30 seconds before filing it away. "Interesting observations," he'd said. "We'll take them under advisement." Translation: "Thanks for playing, but we'll handle the real analysis." "Falcon Flight, Quartz is on the scope," Reynolds announced. "Multiple contacts bearing 240, range 40 miles. Becca switched to her targeting radar, passive mode only. She could see them too, 4 distinct contacts moving in a formation she'd never seen before. Not the standard diamond or line abreast patterns taught in flight school. This was something more complex, more fluid. "They're using a rotating formation," she whispered to herself, making notes on her kneeboard. Constant position changes to confuse targeting solutions. But there was no one to tell, no one to warn. She watched as the Rafales began their approach, their formation shifting like a living thing. The lead aircraft would fade back while the wingman moved forward, then the entire formation would rotate positions. To American radar operators, it would look like the contacts were constantly changing course and speed. "Falcon Leader, I'm having trouble getting a clean lock," Foster's voice carried tension. "Contacts are shifting too fast." "Stay with your targeting solution," Reynolds ordered. "They're just being fancy." But Becca could see what was really happening. The Rafales weren't being fancy, they were being smart. By constantly changing positions, they were preventing the F-16s from establishing the steady tracking needed for effective missile shots. Her radio crackled with the observer frequency. "Thermal observer, this is Control. Request status report." Becca keyed her mic. "Control observer, I'm tracking multiple heat signatures in the target area. She hesitated. Her instructions were clear. Collect data, don't interpret. "Observer, say again." "Control, thermal patterns are nominal. Continuing observation." She released the mic button, frustrated. There was so much she could tell them, so much that could help. But her voice didn't matter here. She was the observer, the note-taker, the pilot who flew but wasn't allowed to fight. Below her, the engagement began in earnest. The Rafales split into 2 pairs, approaching the F-16 formation from different angles. Becca watched through her sensors as the French pilots deployed their flares in a pattern she'd been tracking for weeks, not random defensive moves, but coordinated deception. "Falcon 3, you've got 2 contacts coming in low," Reynolds called out. "Roger, I see them," Foster replied, attempting to engage. But the Rafales were already shifting again, their thermal signatures mixing with their flares to create a confusing cloud of heat sources. Becca knew from her studies that standard American targeting systems couldn't distinguish between real engines and advanced decoy flares at ranges under 10 miles. She wanted to key her radio, to warn Foster about the thermal masking technique she was about to face. Instead, she watched in silence as Foster's F-16 committed to an attack run against what Becca knew was a decoy signature. "Falcon 3, break right!" Reynolds' voice was sharp with urgency. Too late. The real Rafale was already behind Foster, having used the flare pattern to mask his position. The tone of a simulated missile lock filled the radio frequency. "Quartz! 2, simulated kill on Falcon 3, Colonel Dubois announced professionally. Foster's frustrated sigh came through the radio. Falcon 3 is down, returning to base. 1 down, 3 to go, and the exercise had been running for less than 10 minutes. Becca looked at her kneeboard, at the pages of data she'd collected, at the patterns she'd identified that could have prevented this. Her hands gripped the control stick tighter as she watched the remaining F-16s struggle against tactics they didn't understand. This wasn't just about winning an exercise. These were lessons that could save lives in real combat, and she was the only one who saw it clearly. Her radio crackled again. "Observer, control. Are you maintaining safe separation from the exercise area?" "Control, Observer. Maintaining position in Corridor 2 as briefed." "Roger, Observer. Continue mission." "Continue mission. Continue watching. Continue being invisible." Below her, another F-16 was maneuvering desperately to avoid a Rafale that seemed to anticipate every move. Becca could see the French pilot's technique. He was using subtle throttle adjustments to mask his heat signature, making it nearly impossible for the American pilot to maintain a steady lock. The technique was in her notes. Page 7, Thermal Management During Close-Range Maneuvering. She documented it after watching Colonel Dubois use it 3 times in previous exercises. But the knowledge sat in her cockpit, useless, while good. Pilots got shot down by tactics they could have defeated if someone had just listened. "Quartz 1, simulated kill on Falcon 2, came the inevitable announcement. 2 down. Becca stared at her control panel, at the radio switches that could connect her to the tactical frequency. One flip of a switch, and she could share what? She knew? But regulations were clear. Observer aircraft maintained radio silence except for emergencies. Was this an emergency? Pilots weren't really dying. No one was in actual danger. But careers were being damaged. Confidence was being shattered. And lessons that could prove critical in future battles were being ignored. She reached for the radio. Switch, then stopped. Breaking radio protocol would end her career at Fire Ridge, probably end her Air Force career entirely. But watching her fellow pilots get systematically defeated by tactics she could counter felt like betrayal. Her hand hovered over the switch as the exercise continued below, each passing minute proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence. Becca's hand trembled over the radio switch as she watched the aerial chess match unfold. Below. 2 F-16s remained, facing 4 Rafales that moved with predatory precision. Major Reynolds and his wingman, Lieutenant Parker, were doing their best, but they were fighting blind against techniques they'd never encountered. "Falcon Leader, I'm getting multiple lock warnings." Parker's voice carried the strain of a pilot pushed to his limits. "I can't tell which ones are real." "Stay calm, Falcon 4. Trust your instruments." But Becca knew the instruments were lying. The Rafales were using a combination of flare deployment and throttle management that created false lock signatures. She documented the technique in detail, tracing the thermal patterns that revealed the deception. Her kneeboard held the solution, drawn in careful pencil lines that no one would ever see. "Control, this is Observer," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tactical frequency. Static answered her. She'd used the wrong channel. "Observer, this is Control. Switch to your assigned frequency immediately." Becca's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd just violated protocol by transmitting on the tactical net. But she was committed now. "Control, Observer has tactical information relevant to ongoing exercise." A pause. Then, "Observer, return to your assigned frequency. You are not authorized for tactical communications." Below her, Parker's F-16 was corkscrewing through the sky, trying to evade a Rafale that seemed to know his every move. The French pilot was using a technique Becca had privately named shadow flying, staying in the F-16's thermal wake while using minute throttle adjustments to match the American pilot's heat signature. The result was that Parker's own sensors showed 2 identical thermal returns, his own engine and the Rafale's. In the confusion, he couldn't tell which contact was which. Falcon 4, you have a bandit in your 6 o'clock, Reynolds called out. Negative, Falcon Leader. My sensors show 2 contacts at my 6. I can't distinguish between them. Becca knew exactly what was happening. She'd seen Colonel Dubois use this technique before, turning an F-16's sophisticated sensors against itself. But she also knew the counter technique, a specific throttle and flare pattern that would reveal the Rafale's true position. Observer, control. You are ordered to switch frequencies immediately. She looked at her control panel, at the switches, that would return her to the silent observer channel. Following orders would be the safe choice. The career-preserving choice. Instead, she switched to the emergency frequency. Any station, this is Fire Ridge Observer with tactical information. The radio exploded with voices. Observer, get off the emergency frequency. Who authorized tactical communication? Control, we need that pilot grounded immediately. But one voice cut through the chaos. Observer, this is Falcon 4. What do you have? Parker. The pilot, who was about to be shot down by a technique she could counter. Falcon 4, your 6 o'clock contact is using thermal shadowing. Deploy 2 flares port side, then execute a sharp climb with full throttle. The real bandit will separate from your thermal signature. Observer, this is Control. Cease all communications immediately. Falcon 4, do you copy? Becca's voice was steady despite the storm of protests filling the radio. Roger, Observer. Deploying flares now. From her altitude, Becca watched. Parker's F-16 execute the maneuver exactly as she'd described. 2 flares arced away from the aircraft's left side, creating brief thermal blooms. Then Parker pulled into a sharp climb, his engine signature flaring bright against the desert sky. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the impossible occurred. A second thermal signature separated from Parker's, revealing the Rafale that had been hiding in his engine wash. Contact! Parker's voice carried disbelief and triumph. I have the bandit! Engaging now! The tables turned in seconds. The Rafale pilot, exposed and caught off guard, tried to evade but couldn't match the F-16's. Position advantage. The tone of a simulated missile lock filled the radio. Falcon 4 simulated kill on Quartz 3, Parker announced. The radio fell silent. Even the control tower seemed shocked by the reversal. Colonel Dubois' voice came through, calm and professional. Well executed, Falcon 4. Quartz 3 returning to base. But Becca knew she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd interfered with an exercise, violated communication protocols, and revealed tactical information that was supposed to remain classified in her observation reports. Observer, this is Control. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Do not communicate with any other aircraft. She keyed her mic one last time. Control, Observer, returning to base. As she turned her F-16 toward Fire Ridge, Becca caught sight of another aircraft in her peripheral vision. One of the Rafales had broken off from the exercise and was flying, parallel to her course, about 2 miles to her right. She recognized the tail markings. Colonel Dubois. The French pilot maintained his position for several minutes, neither approaching nor falling back. Then slowly, he waggled his wings, the traditional pilot's salute between professionals. Becca found herself returning the gesture automatically. Whatever else happened, she'd earned the respect of one of the best pilots in the sky. But as Fire Ridge grew larger on the horizon, she knew that respect might be the only positive outcome of her decision. By the time she landed, there would be forms to fill out, explanations to give, and probably a career to salvage. She'd broken the rules to save a fellow pilot from defeat. In the military, that could be viewed as either heroism or insubordination. She was about to find out which. The debrief room felt like a courtroom. Becca sat alone in the front row, still wearing her flight suit, while the other pilots filled the seats behind her. Major Hawkins stood at the front, his face carved from stone, while Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, occupied a chair to his right. Morrison was a legend at Fire Ridge, a pilot who'd flown combat missions in 3 different wars. His presence at what should have been a routine exercise debrief meant Becca's breach of protocol had reached the highest levels of command. Let's start with the communications violation, Morrison said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. Lieutenant Martinez, You were specifically briefed that observer aircraft maintain radio silence except for emergencies. What emergency? Justified your breach of protocol? Becca stood, her hands clasped behind her back. Sir, I observed tactical techniques being employed that I believed could be countered with information I'd collected during previous exercises. That's not an emergency, Lieutenant. That's a judgment call you weren't authorized to make. Behind her, she could hear whispered conversations. Some pilots were probably enjoying her public humiliation. Others might be wondering if she'd just ended her career over a training exercise. However, Morrison continued, and Becca felt her heart stop, the technique you described to Lieutenant Parker was accurate and effective. Where did you learn it? Sir, I've been collecting thermal data for 6 weeks. The Rafale pilots have been using consistent patterns that create targeting confusion. I identified countermeasures through analysis of their engine management techniques. Major Hawkins stepped forward. Sir, Lieutenant Martinez's role is data collection, not tactical analysis. That's handled by intelligence specialists with appropriate clearance levels. I see. Morrison's eyes never left Becca's face. And what did your intelligence specialists conclude about these thermal patterns? Hawkins hesitated. Sir, we're still evaluating the data. For 6 weeks? The room went dead silent. Becca realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, the base commander challenging his own intelligence apparatus in front of junior officers. Morrison stood and walked to the tactical display. Colonel Dubois, would you join us? The French pilot rose from the back of the room, his movements precise and measured. As he passed Becca, she caught a glimpse of something in his expression, not hostility, but professional curiosity. Colonel, is it accurate that your pilots have been employing thermal management techniques designed to confuse American targeting systems? Dubois nodded. Yes, sir. These techniques are part of standard Rafale combat doctrine. We assumed American intelligence was familiar with them. And the countermeasure Lieutenant Martinez described to Lieutenant Parker? Correct and effective. It's taught in our own training programs as a defense against the technique. Morrison turned back to Becca. Lieutenant, where did you learn this countermeasure? Sir, I developed it through analysis of the thermal patterns I observed. I noticed that the deception technique created a slight delay in throttle response, which could be exploited through specific flare deployment and engine management. You developed it yourself? Yes, sir. The room erupted in whispers until Morrison's glare restored silence. Gentlemen, Morrison addressed the room, we have a situation here. Our intelligence apparatus has spent 6 weeks evaluating tactical information that one of our pilots analyzed and applied successfully in real time. Meanwhile, that same pilot has been relegated to observer status and told her analysis doesn't matter. He paused, letting the words sink in. Colonel Dubois, in your professional opinion, what's the value of Lieutenant Martinez's thermal analysis? Sir, her understanding of our techniques is more sophisticated than most of your intelligence briefings. The countermeasures she's identified would significantly reduce our tactical advantage. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Here was one of the world's best pilots, essentially saying that Becca's work was superior to official Air Force intelligence analysis. Major Hawkins's face had gone pale. Sir, I'm sure there are procedural reasons why— Major? Morrison's voice cut like a blade. The only procedural failure I see is our inability to recognize and utilize the talent sitting in this room. Lieutenant Martinez, you'll report to my office at Odor 800 tomorrow. We need to discuss your future role in this program. As the meeting broke up, Becca felt both relief and anxiety. She wasn't being court-martialed, but she wasn't sure what came next. Foster approached as the room emptied. That was incredible, she said quietly. I've never seen Morrison dress down intelligence like that. I'm not sure it was worth it, Becca replied. I still violated protocol. You saved Parker from getting shot down. In real combat, that technique might have saved his life. Colonel Dubois appeared beside them, his expression thoughtful. Lieutenant Martinez, might I have a word? Foster excused herself, leaving Becca alone with the French pilot. She expected criticism, perhaps anger at having her tactics exposed. Instead, Dubois smiled. You fly like a hunter, not an observer. That maneuver you suggested, it showed you understand our techniques better than most pilots who've been fighting against them for years. Thank you, sir. In the French Air Force, we have a saying, l'observation sans action est inutile. Observation without action is useless. Today you took action. It was the right thing to do. As Dubois walked away, Becca realized that everything had changed. For 6 weeks she'd been invisible, relegated to the sidelines, told her work didn't matter. Now, suddenly, she was at the center of attention. But attention in the military could be dangerous. Some people would see her intervention as necessary, others would view it as insubordination that set a dangerous precedent. Tomorrow morning, she'd learn which interpretation would define her future. That evening, alone in her quarters, Becca reviewed her thermal analysis one more time. Pages of hand-drawn curves, carefully plotted patterns, techniques developed through weeks of patient observation. Work that had been dismissed as unimportant until the moment it saved a fellow pilot from defeat. She thought about Colonel Dubois' words. Observation without action is useless. Maybe it was time to stop being just an observer. Becca stood at attention outside Colonel Morrison's office at precisely 0800, her service cap tucked under her left arm, her uniform pressed to regulation perfection. Through the frosted glass door, she could see Morrison's silhouette behind his desk, along with another figure she couldn't identify. "Enter," came the colonel's voice. She stepped inside to find Morrison seated behind his desk, with a woman, in civilian clothes, occupying one of the guest chairs. The woman was perhaps 45, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "Lieutenant Martinez, please be seated." Morrison gestured to the empty chair. "This is Dr. Angela Webb from the Air Force Weapons School. She's here to discuss your tactical analysis." Webb extended her hand. "Lieutenant, I've reviewed your thermal data from the past 6 weeks. Impressive work, especially considering you developed these techniques independently." Becca felt off balance. She'd expected disciplinary action, not praise from a weapons school specialist. "Thank you, ma'am." "Dr. Webb," Morrison continued, "has been investigating reports of foreign tactical techniques that our intelligence community has been slow to address. Your intervention yesterday brought this issue to official attention." Webb opened a folder thick with documents. "Lieutenant, are you familiar with the concept of tactical data fusion?" "Yes, ma'am, combining multiple intelligence sources to create comprehensive threat assessments." "Exactly. For months, we've been receiving fragments of information about advanced foreign tactics, pilot reports, sensor data, exercise outcomes, but no one was connecting the pieces until your analysis." She pulled out several documents, spreading them across Morrison's desk. "These are reports from exercises at Nellis, Red Flag, and 3 NATO training events. All describe similar targeting anomalies, thermal confusion, and unexpected tactical defeats. Sound familiar?" Becca leaned forward, studying the papers. The patterns were identical to what she'd observed at Fire Ridge, American pilots struggling against techniques they couldn't understand or counter. "Ma'am, these are all describing variations of the same thermal management doctrine. The specific techniques vary, but the underlying principles are consistent." "That's exactly what we suspected." Webb's voice carried excitement. "But you're the first person to identify the core methodology and develop effective countermeasures." Morrison stepped around his desk. "Lieutenant, what Dr. Webb isn't telling you is that her investigation has revealed systematic failures in our intelligence analysis. Your work has exposed significant gaps in our tactical preparation." The implications hit Becca like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Fire Ridge or training exercises. This was about real combat readiness, about American pilots facing enemies they weren't prepared to fight. "Sir, I was just collecting data. I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize you were conducting the analysis that our intelligence specialists should have completed months ago," Morrison finished. "The question now is what we do about it." Webb gathered her documents. "Lieutenant, I'm prepared to offer you a position with the Weapons School Tactical Analysis Division. You'd be working directly with combat pilots, developing countermeasures for emerging threats." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Becca had spent 6 weeks fighting for recognition, for the chance to contribute meaningfully. Now she was being offered exactly what she'd wanted, but something felt wrong. "Ma'am, what about the other pilots here? Foster, Parker, the others who've been struggling against these techniques? They deserve to know what I've learned." Webb exchanged a glance with Morrison. "That's complicated. The techniques you've identified are now classified. Dissemination would be handled through proper channels." Meaning? "Meaning it could take months for this information to reach operational units," Morrison said quietly. "The military bureaucracy moves slowly, even for critical intelligence." Becca thought about Foster's frustration, about Parker nearly getting shot down, about all the pilots who would face these techniques without understanding them. The classification process would protect the information while pilots continued to lose exercises and potentially real battles. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" Morrison nodded. "The pilots here at Fire Ridge are facing these techniques right now, today. They're good pilots being defeated by tactics they could counter if they had the right information. Waiting months for bureaucratic approval means accepting continued defeats." "What are you suggesting, Lieutenant?" Becca took a breath, knowing her next words would define her career. "Sir, I'm suggesting we share this information immediately with the pilots who need it, not through classified briefings or official channels, but through practical training that gives them the tools to succeed." Webb frowned. "Lieutenant, you're talking about bypassing established security protocols." "Ma'am, I'm talking about preparing American pilots to win battles. Isn't that what we're here for?" The room fell silent. Morrison walked to his window, staring out at the flight line where jets were already preparing for the day's exercises. "Dr. Webb," he said finally, "how long would it take to classify Lieutenant Martinez's analysis and distribute it through proper channels?" 4 to 6 months minimum, possibly longer if it requires security review." "And how many training exercises will we conduct in that time?" "Approximately 40 to 50, sir." Morrison turned back to face them. 40 to 50 exercises where American pilots will be defeated by techniques we know how to counter because we're too concerned with procedure to share life-saving information." Webb shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, there are established processes. For good reasons. Dr. Webb, I've been flying combat missions for 23 years. I've seen good pilots die because critical information was buried in classified reports they never had access to. I won't let that happen again." He walked back to his desk, his decision clear in his posture. "Lieutenant Martinez, you'll continue your observer role for now, but I'm also assigning you to develop informal training scenarios that will help our pilots understand these techniques. Nothing classified, nothing that violates security protocols, just practical education." "Sir, how do I share tactical countermeasures without revealing classified analysis?" Morrison smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office. "You're a pilot, Lieutenant. Pilots learn by flying. Show them." Webb gathered her documents, clearly unhappy with the direction of the conversation. "Colonel, I'll need to report this decision to my superiors." "You do that, Doctor, and you can tell them that Fire Ridge Base prioritizes pilot preparedness over bureaucratic convenience." After Webb left, Morrison turned to Becca. "Lieutenant, you've got 48 hours to design training scenarios that will teach our pilots to counter these techniques. Can you do it?" "Yes, sir." "Good, because starting Monday, you're not just the observer anymore. You're going to be the teacher." As Becca left Morrison's office, her mind was already racing with possibilities. For 6 weeks, she'd been forced to watch in silence as good pilots struggled against superior techniques. Now she had the chance to even the odds, but she also knew that teaching these techniques would make her a target. The intelligence community didn't appreciate being shown up by junior officers. Webb would report this conversation, and there would be consequences. Still, as she watched the morning's exercise preparations, she felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at Fire Ridge: purpose. Tomorrow, the real training would begin. Monday morning arrived with the kind of desert clarity that made every detail sharp and unforgiving. Becca stood beside her F-16 at 0630, watching the usual pre-flight routine unfold across the tarmac. But today felt different. Today she wasn't just the observer. Foster approached first, her helmet tucked under her arm, expression curious. "I heard Morrison gave you some kind of special assignment." "Something like that." Becca checked her. "Watch. Are you flying today's exercise?" "Leading Falcon flight. Why?" "Because I'm going to show you how to beat the Rafales." Foster's eyebrows shot up. "Show me? You're still flying observer missions." "Not exactly." Becca pulled out her kneeboard, opening to a page filled with diagrams. "Morrison approved me to develop practical training scenarios. Turns out the best way to teach tactics is to demonstrate them." Parker joined them, followed by 2 other pilots from Falcon Squadron. Word was spreading that something unusual was happening around the observer aircraft. "Listen up," Becca said, gathering the small group around her wing. "For 6 weeks, I've been watching you get shot down by techniques that you could counter if you understood them. Today, that changes." She pointed to her first diagram. "The Rafales are using thermal signature manipulation to confuse your targeting systems. They're not just deploying flares randomly, they're creating false heat signatures that mimic your own engine patterns." "We know they're using flares," Parker said. "Every pilot uses flares. But not like this." Becca flipped to another page. "Watch Colonel Dubois during his next approach. He'll match his throttle settings to your engine output, creating identical thermal signatures. Your sensors will show 2 contacts in the same location, your engine and his, making it impossible to distinguish between them." Foster studied the diagram. "So how do we counter it?" "By creating thermal separation. When you detect multiple signatures at the same location, execute this maneuver." Becca sketched quickly. "Deploy flares to port or starboard, not aft, then execute a high-alpha climb with full afterburner. The sudden thermal spike will separate your signature from his, revealing his true position." "That's exactly what you told me yesterday," Parker said. "It worked perfectly." "Because the technique is sound. The Rafales know it too. It's how they defend against their own tactics." Captain Wright appeared at the edge of the group, his expression skeptical. "Martinez, this is all theoretical. How do we know these techniques work in real combat?" Becca met his gaze directly. "Because today I'm going to fly against you and show you exactly how they work." The group fell silent. Wright looked confused. "You're observer. You don't engage." "Today I do. Morrison approved a new training protocol. I'm going to simulate Rafale tactics while you practice the countermeasures." She could see the doubt in their faces. The observer pilot, the one they'd dismissed for weeks, was now claiming she could outfly them using foreign techniques. "Here's how it works," Becca continued. "Normal exercise parameters, but I'm authorized to engage. I'll use the thermal management techniques the Rafales have been employing. Your job is to apply the countermeasures I've just described." Foster looked intrigued. "What if the countermeasures don't work?" "Then you'll get shot down by the observer pilot, and you'll have learned something valuable about the techniques you're facing." Wright crossed his arms. "And if they do work?" "Then you'll be prepared to beat the Rafales at their own game." An hour later, the morning briefing took on an unprecedented character. Major Hawkins stood at the front, clearly uncomfortable, with the new training protocol. "Today's exercise will feature modified parameters," he announced. "The observer aircraft is authorized for limited engagement using simulated foreign tactics. This is an experimental training scenario approved by Colonel Morrison." Murmurs filled the room. Several pilots looked confused, others excited. The Rafale pilots, seated together in the front rows, exchanged glances. Colonel Dubois raised his hand. "Sir, will the observer aircraft be employing our actual techniques?" "That's classified, Colonel, but you're welcome to observe the exercise and provide feedback during debrief." Dubois nodded, but Becca caught something in his expression. Professional curiosity mixed with what might have been respect. 30 minutes later, Becca was airborne, her F-16 climbing toward the exercise area. For the first time in 6 weeks, her radio was active on the tactical frequency. "Control, this is Shadow 1, requesting permission to enter the exercise area." "Shadow 1, Control, you are cleared to enter. Be advised, Falcon flight is already in position." "Shadow 1. Morrison had assigned her a temporary call sign for the exercise. No longer just observer or thermal, she was Shadow, a name that suggested stealth, intelligence, and the ability to appear where least expected. Shadow 1, this is Falcon Leader, Foster's voice came through clearly. Are you ready to show us what you've got? Becca smiled inside her oxygen mask. Falcon Leader, Shadow 1. Let's see if you've been paying attention. She dropped her F-16 into a shallow dive, approaching the Falcon formation from below and behind. Her first demonstration would be the thermal shadowing technique, the same one that had nearly defeated Parker the day before. Positioning herself carefully in Parker's engine wash, she began matching his throttle settings, creating the identical thermal signature that had confused him yesterday. On his sensors, it would appear as if his own engine signature had doubled. Falcon 4, you should be seeing the anomaly now, she called over the radio. Roger, Shadow. I'm showing 2 thermal contacts at my 6 o'clock. They're identical. Now execute the countermeasure. She watched as Parker deployed flares to his starboard side, then pulled into a sharp climb. His engine signature flared, bright and distinct, immediately separating from her more subtle thermal output. Contact! Parker's voice carried excitement. I can see you now, Shadow. You're low and to my left. Excellent. That's exactly how you defeat thermal shadowing. For the next 40 minutes, Becca demonstrated technique after technique, always followed by the appropriate countermeasure. She showed them false lock generation, coordinated flare deception, and formation thermal masking. Each time, the Falcon pilots applied her countermeasures and successfully defeated the tactics. But the real test came at the end of the exercise. Shadow 1, this is Control. Quartz Flight is requesting permission to engage you directly. Becca felt her pulse quicken. The Rafale pilots wanted to test her skills against their actual techniques, not the demonstrations she'd been conducting. Control, Shadow 1. Tell Quartz I accept their challenge. Roger, Shadow. Be advised, this is unofficial engagement. No scoring will be recorded, which meant no rules, no restrictions, no safety margins, just pilot against pilot, technique against technique. Shadow 1, this is Quartz Leader. Colonel Dubois' voice carried a hint of amusement. Let's see how well you really understand our methods. As 4 Rafales appeared on her scope, approaching from different vectors, Becca realized she was about to face the ultimate test of everything she'd learned. The student was about to challenge the masters. The Nevada sky stretched endlessly, blue as 4 Rafales converged on Becca's position, their formation fluid and predatory. She was outnumbered 4-1, flying an older aircraft against some of the world's most advanced fighters, piloted by experts in the techniques she'd been studying for weeks. Any sane pilot would have requested permission to disengage. Instead, Becca smiled inside her oxygen mask and pushed her throttle forward. Shadow 1, this is Quartz Leader. Colonel Dubois' voice carried professional respect. Are you certain you want to continue? No shame in declining a 4 versus 1 engagement. Quartz Leader, Shadow 1. I've been watching you for 6 weeks. Time to see if I learned anything. Below, the Falcon pilots had moved to a safe distance to observe the engagement. Becca could hear Foster's voice on the tactical frequency. Control, Falcon flight is clear of the engagement area and ready to observe. The first Rafale came in fast and low, using a technique Becca had labeled false approach in her notes. The pilot would commit to an attack run, then use superior agility to break off at the last second, drawing defensive reactions that left his wingman free to attack from an unexpected angle. She'd seen it work against American pilots dozens of times. This time, she was ready. Instead of reacting to the obvious threat, Becca kept her sensors focused on the surrounding airspace, tracking the subtle thermal signatures of the other 3. Rafales. There, 2 miles to her right, another aircraft was positioning for the real attack while she was supposed to be focused on the decoy. Quartz 2, I see you, she called over the radio, turning sharply toward the flanking aircraft. The Rafale pilot, caught off guard by her awareness, broke off his approach. His surprise was audible in his transmission. Shadow 1, how did you detect that approach? Trade secret, Quartz 2. But Colonel Dubois was already adapting. Quartz, flight, execute pattern Delta. Becca had never seen pattern Delta, but she recognized the formation change immediately. All 4 Rafales spread into a wide circle around her position, each maintaining the same distance and altitude. From her thermal sensors, it would appear as 4 identical contacts at the edge of her engagement envelope. Classic formation thermal masking, making it impossible to distinguish between threats by making them all appear identical. Clever. Quartz leader, but you're forgetting something. She pulled her F-16 into a sharp climb, heading directly toward the center of their formation. To the Rafale pilots, it would appear suicidal, flying directly into the teeth of 4 hostile aircraft, but Becca knew something they didn't expect her to know. At the center of a circular formation, all 4 aircraft would be equidistant from her position. But because of the physics of thermal propagation in desert air, their engine signatures would reach her sensors at slightly different times based on their relative positions to the sun. She'd calculated the thermal delay patterns weeks ago, during her lonely hours of data analysis. "Quartz 3, you're the closest," she announced, turning toward what appeared to be empty airspace. "Impossible," came the reply. "You can't distinguish between our positions." "Physics disagrees with you." She locked onto Quartz 3's position using pure thermal analysis. No radar, no visual contact. Her missile tone filled the frequency. "Quartz 3, you're spiked," she announced, using the call that indicated a missile lock. A pause. Then, "Confirmed, Shadow 1. How the hell did you do that?" But there was no time to explain. The other 3 Rafales were already converging on her position, using their superior numbers to press the attack. Becca deployed flares in a pattern she'd never used before, not the random scattering most pilots employed, but a carefully calculated thermal mosaic designed to create false targeting solutions. Each flare was positioned to mimic the heat signature of her engine at different positions, creating the illusion that her F-16 was simultaneously in multiple locations. The technique was her own invention, developed during weeks of studying Rafale methods and wondering how to counter them. Shadow 1, Quartz leader. That's not in our playbook. It's in mine. She watched on her thermal display as the remaining 3 Rafales hesitated, their targeting systems confused by the multiple heat sources. In that moment of uncertainty, she struck. A sharp dive took her below their engagement envelope, using the desert thermal layer to mask her heat signature. She'd studied the local weather patterns, noting how hot air rising from the desert floor created a thermal barrier that confused infrared sensors. Flying just above the desert, invisible to thermal detection, she circled back toward the Rafale formation. "Quartz 2, check your 6 o'clock low," she called out as she climbed back into engagement altitude, directly behind the second Rafale. "What? How are you—" The pilot's voice cut off as his threat warning system activated. "Quartz 2, you're spiked." 2 down. The remaining pilots, Colonel Dubois and Quartz 4, pulled into a tight defensive formation. These were the experts, the most experienced pilots in the French Air Force. They wouldn't be surprised again. "Shadow 1, Dubois' voice carried. Genuine admiration. "You've been studying us more carefully than we realized. 6 weeks of watching every flight, every maneuver, every technique. You're excellent pilots, Colonel, but you're predictable." Predictable? Becca had saved her. Best surprise for last. "You always finish with the carousel." The carousel was Dubois' signature maneuver, a complex spiral pattern that used constant altitude and direction changes to confuse enemy targeting while maintaining offensive capability. She'd watched him use it successfully against American pilots in every previous exercise. But she'd also identified its weakness. The maneuver required precise timing and positioning. If she could force Dubois to begin the carousel early, she could predict exactly where he'd be at each point in the pattern. "Quartz leader incoming," she announced, diving toward his position. As expected, Dubois immediately began the carousel, his aircraft spiraling through the complex evasion pattern, but Becca didn't try to follow him through the maneuver. Instead, she pulled into a high-alpha climb, positioning herself at the exact point where the carousel pattern would place him in 30 seconds. "Quartz leader, you should be arriving now," she said, as his aircraft appeared exactly where her calculations predicted. Her missile tone locked immediately. "Quartz leader, you're spiked." The radio fell silent. Even Quartz 4 seemed stunned by the reversal. "Shadow 1, how did you know where I'd be?" Mathematics, Colonel. The carousel follows geometric principles. Once I mapped the pattern, I could predict your position at any point in the sequence. Colonel Dubois' laughter came through clearly. Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. Shadow. One, would you join us for debrief? I believe we have much to discuss. As Becca turned her F-16 toward home, she realized that everything had changed. For 6 weeks, she'd been the observer, the note-taker, the pilot whose voice didn't matter. Now she'd just outflown 4 of the world's best pilots using techniques they'd never seen before. But more importantly, she'd proven that intelligence and preparation could overcome superior technology and experience. Control. Shadow 1 returning to base. Roger, Shadow 1. Outstanding flight. The landing pattern was routine, but as Becca taxied toward her parking spot, she noticed something different. Pilots and ground crew were gathered along the taxiway, watching her approach. When she shut down her engine and climbed out of the cockpit, spontaneous applause broke out. Foster was the first to reach her. "That was incredible! How did you develop those techniques?" 6 weeks of watching, learning, and thinking about problems differently. Colonel Dubois approached, pulling off his flight helmet. "Lieutenant Martinez, in 30 years of flying, I've rarely seen such tactical innovation. You've taken our own techniques and evolved them beyond what we thought possible." Major Hawkins appeared at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant, Colonel Morrison wants to see you immediately." As she walked toward the command building, Becca realized that her career had reached another crossroads. She'd proven herself as a pilot and tactician, but she'd also challenged established hierarchies and procedures. In the military, that could lead to promotion or punishment, often depending on factors beyond individual performance. But for the first time since arriving at Fire Ridge, she felt like she belonged. Not because someone had given her permission, but because she'd earned her place through skill, dedication, and the courage to act when action was needed. Colonel Morrison was waiting in his office, along with Dr. Webb and 2 other officers Becca didn't recognize. "Lieutenant," Morrison said, "congratulations on an exceptional performance. Dr. Webb has some interesting news for you." Webb stepped forward, her earlier disapproval replaced by professional respect. "Lieutenant Martinez, based on today's demonstration, the Weapons School is prepared to offer you an immediate transfer to our Tactical Development Division. You'd be working with the Air Force's top pilots to develop countermeasures for emerging threats." It was everything she'd dreamed of: recognition, advancement, the chance to make a real difference in air combat tactics. But as she looked around the room, Becca realized something important. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I'd like to request something different." "Which is?" "Permission to stay at Fire Ridge and establish a formal tactical analysis program, train pilots to recognize and counter advanced foreign techniques, make this knowledge available to every pilot who needs it, not just the elite few." Morrison smiled. "Lieutenant, are you turning down a promotion to stay at a training base?" "Sir, I'm choosing to stay where I can do the most good. The pilots here deserve to know what I've learned. All of them." Webb looked confused. "Lieutenant, the Weapons School offers significantly more prestige and advancement opportunities." "Ma'am, prestige doesn't win battles. Prepared pilots do." Morrison walked to his window, looking out at the flight line where pilots were already preparing for the afternoon exercises. "Dr. Webb, I believe Lieutenant Martinez has identified a critical gap in our training programs. Perhaps it's time to formalize tactical analysis at the squadron level." "Sir, that would require significant bureaucratic approval." "Then we'll get approval. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Martinez will continue developing her program here at Fire Ridge." As the meeting ended and the other officers filed out, Morrison turned to Becca one final time. "Lieutenant, you've accomplished something remarkable here. You've proven that excellence can emerge from anywhere, even from the shadows. But remember, with recognition comes responsibility. People will be watching you now, expecting continued excellence." "I understand, sir." "Good, because starting tomorrow, you're no longer the observer. You're the instructor." That evening, Becca sat in her quarters, reviewing the day's events. Her kneeboard lay open beside her, filled with new techniques and tactical insights developed during the engagement with the Rafales. Tomorrow she'd begin sharing this knowledge with every pilot at Fire Ridge. She thought about the long journey from being dismissed as just an observer to becoming someone whose voice mattered. It hadn't happened because someone decided to give her a chance. It had happened because she'd refused to accept limitations others tried to place on her. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Outstanding flight today. Look forward to flying against you again soon. Colonel Dubois. She smiled and began planning tomorrow's training scenarios. There was work to do, pilots to train, and techniques to share. For the first time since arriving at Fire Ridge, Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez was exactly where she belonged. Not in the shadows, but in the light, teaching others to see what she had learned to see. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in the sky, but in the quiet moments when someone decides their voice deserves to be heard. And sometimes the most powerful victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from proving that excellence has no prerequisites except dedication and the courage to act. The observer had become the instructor. The shadow had become the light. And tomorrow she'd begin teaching others to fly from the shadows into their own moments of recognition. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.